Detective Lena Marshall stared at the DNA report in disbelief, her coffee untouched beside her. The hum of fluorescent light filled the quiet lab, a sound that had become too familiar after 30 years of unanswered questions. In her hands sat a single sheet of paper, printed in black and white, yet heavy enough to alter the course of everything she'd spent her life chasing. For decades, she had combed through witness lists, soil samples, phone logs, and fragments of evidence so thin they barely qualified as hope. But this was different. "Run it again," she whispered. The technician looked up from the monitor and shook his head. "We've already run it 3 times, Detective. The match is 99.9% conclusive." Marshall said nothing. She lowered the paper to the table and exhaled slowly, her pulse steady but her thoughts spinning. The name on the report wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a transient or a drifter or one of the usual suspects that drifted in and out of small-town rumor. It was someone she'd seen every year at community fundraisers, someone who had spoken with compassion during vigils for the missing, someone who had comforted parents when the town's faith began to collapse. She reached for her phone. "Get Sheriff Reed. Tell him we've got something." Within hours, word spread quietly through the chain of command. The small agricultural town of Silver Creek, Alberta, population just over 4,000, was about to learn a truth more horrifying than the decades of uncertainty they'd lived with. The man who had been a guardian, a helper, a name on every emergency contact list for 30 years, was about to be revealed as the monster who had stolen 2 one-year-old children from their cribs 6 years apart. Before we go any deeper into this shocking case, take a second to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us keep bringing you real investigations and forensic breakthroughs from around the world. Now, let's get into the story. October 14, 1993. It was harvest season. The Morrison family's small farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by bare fields and rust-colored trees. Inside, Claire Morrison was folding laundry while her husband, David, watched a hockey game. Their 1-year-old daughter, Grace, had gone down early, asleep in her crib beside the window. Claire would later recall a sudden stillness in the house, an instinctive chill that pulled her awake just after 10 p.m. When she opened the nursery door, the window was ajar, curtains stirring in the autumn air. The crib was empty. Grace was gone. Within 40 minutes, headlights flickered along the gravel lane. Deputies and neighbors scoured the property with flashlights, combing through barns, tree lines, and drainage ditches. By dawn, the search stretched 5 miles in every direction. Helicopters hovered overhead, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police established checkpoints along Highway 21. The only object recovered was Grace's yellow teddy bear, discovered caught in a barbed wire fence 2 fields away. There were no footprints, no tire marks, no signs of struggle. Even the family dog had slept through the night. The investigation became national news within days. Television trucks lined the country road. Volunteers arrived from neighboring provinces. Everyone wanted to help, and everyone needed an answer. Detective Reed, then a young sergeant, coordinated the effort. "We were looking for a ghost," he would later say. "Someone who moved through that house without leaving a trace." For 6 months, the case consumed Silver Creek. Tips flooded in. Truck drivers reporting strangers at rest stops, psychics describing visions of barns, drifters questioned and released. Nothing held. Winter came. The snow erased what little evidence remained. By spring, the search parties had dwindled, replaced by annual candlelight vigils. The Morrisons sold their farm 2 years later and moved north, leaving the nursery untouched behind closed doors. The file, labeled Grace Morrison, Unresolved Abduction, gathered dust in an evidence locker. Then 6 years later, history repeated itself. May 9th, 1999. The Bennetts lived 15 miles south of Silver Creek in a modest bungalow near the train yard. Their son, Ethan, had just celebrated his first birthday. Family video captured him laughing in a high chair, clapping to a toy song. That Sunday evening, Alyssa Bennett tucked Ethan into bed with his blue blanket. At 2:17 a.m., the home alarm chimed once, then reset. Her husband, Mark, checked the panel, saw nothing and went back to sleep. At sunrise, when Alyssa entered the nursery, the crib was empty and the window screen lay neatly on the floor. Deputies arrived within minutes. Shoe impressions, size 10 work boots, led from the window toward the service road but disappeared on gravel. There were no fingerprints, no forced entry, no motive. Every parent in Silver Creek understood immediately it had happened again. The next few weeks were chaos. Media helicopters hovered above search lines, stretching through fields still wet with spring melt. Churches opened 24-hour prayer centers. Residents installed locks on every window. Hardware stores sold out of motion lights. And in the middle of every search photo stood the same man, Dr. Adrien Holt, the town's senior paramedic. Calm, dependable, always the first to volunteer. He had treated the Morrisons for shock 6 years earlier. Now he held Alyssa Bennett's hand outside her home as cameras rolled. People needed someone to believe in, and Holt looked like safety itself. By the early 2000s, both cases were cold. The RCMP had logged thousands of leads, interviewed every known offender within 300 miles, and re-examined evidence with each new forensic technique. Nothing. Detective Lena Marshall joined the Provincial Cold Case Unit in 2004. She inherited both files on her first day. Every photograph, every map, every unanswered question came to her desk. It felt like walking into a storm that had never ended, she would later say. She began comparing timelines, volunteers, and first responders. A pattern emerged. In both abductions, the first medical responder on scene had been Adrien Holt. He'd signed the intake reports himself, but there was nothing to tie him to the crime. No DNA, no witness, no reason to suspect a man so publicly devoted to helping others. Over the next 2 decades, technology advanced faster than the case. Partial fingerprints were digitized, trace fibers catalogued, and tiny samples of biological material preserved under climate control. We were waiting for science to catch up, Marshall explained. Meanwhile, Silver Creek lived under quiet vigilance. Parents taught children not to open doors. Teenagers grew up attending vigils for victims they never met. The Morrisons and the Bennetts became symbols of endurance, a reminder that justice sometimes sleeps. In 2018, the province funded a pilot program to retest evidence from unsolved child abductions. Marshall submitted both Silver Creek cases. Years passed with no update, until January 2023, when a call came from the Alberta Forensic Laboratory in Edmonton. A new sequencing method called molecular ancestry reconstruction, a technology capable of building complete genetic profiles from degraded fragments, had yielded 2 usable DNA samples. One from the seam of Grace's yellow bear, the other from fibers on Ethan's blue blanket. Both belonged to the same unknown male. When the lab cross-referenced the data through familial DNA algorithms, one partial match appeared. A voluntary donor from a medical research study, Dr. Adrien Holt, a pediatrician. Her brother, Adrien Holt, still lived in Silver Creek. Marshall froze as the report loaded on her screen. After 30 years, the ghost finally had a name. She formed a small, confidential task force. Surveillance teams tracked Holt's routines: grocery runs, morning coffee, evening walks with his dog along Ravens Hollow Road. On the surface, he was unremarkable, polite, solitary, quietly respected. But his history aligned too perfectly. He'd been on duty the nights both children disappeared. He owned property within driving distance of both homes. For 10 days they watched. On February 3rd, an undercover officer collected Holt's discarded coffee cup from a diner. The DNA matched both crime scene samples at 12 genetic loci, beyond statistical dispute. Marshall authorized simultaneous warrants for his home, vehicle, and medical storage unit. Before dawn on February 6th, snow fell thick across the valley. A convoy of unmarked trucks rolled silently up the long drive to Holt's property. The barn lights glowed faintly through the fog. When officers entered, Holt was sitting at his kitchen table reading the morning paper. He looked up once, expression calm. "I assume this is about Silver Creek," he said. In the basement, they found the entrance to a sealed root cellar. Beneath layers of boards lay evidence, items preserved with obsessive care: 2 crib blankets labeled with initials, and a small box containing infant keepsakes. Every object was logged, sealed, and rushed to Edmonton for analysis. That night, as news spread of Holt's arrest, Silver Creek's main street went silent. The paramedic who had saved so many lives had been hiding the town's darkest secret. Word of Adrien Holt's arrest spread faster than official statements could contain it. By sunrise, Silver Creek was surrounded by news vans, their satellite dishes glinting under the thin winter sun. Reporters broadcast live from the corner of Main and Cedar, where for years Holt had parked the county ambulance. A respected medic, an award-winning volunteer, one anchor said, her breath clouding in the cold air, now under investigation for the most shocking crimes this province has ever seen. Inside the temporary command post, Detective Lena Marshall studied the evidence wall, a tangle of photographs, DNA charts, and property maps. The basement items were still in transit to Edmonton, but preliminary field tests already showed positive traces of Holt's DNA on both blankets. It was enough to justify full forensic excavation of his land. Snow still covered the field surrounding his house, but ground-penetrating radar identified two rectangular anomalies beneath the soil of an old orchard. The first measured roughly 6 feet long, the second slightly smaller. They were located beneath a concrete pad once used as a tool shed foundation. The forensic team worked through the night under portable lights. When they reached the top layer of soil, they uncovered fragments of cloth consistent with the fabric of a child's blanket. The excavation halted immediately, while specialists took over. Within 48 hours, dental and DNA analysis confirmed what the town had feared for 30 years. Grace Morrison and Ethan Bennett had been found. Detective Marshall stared at the report in silence. She had promised the families she would bring them home, but she had never imagined doing it like this. The RCMP released a carefully worded statement at noon the following day. Remains believed to be those of 2 children abducted in Silver Creek in 1993 and 1999 have been recovered on property belonging to former paramedic Adrien Holt. The investigation is ongoing. The town went still. Businesses closed early. Church bells tolled at sunset. Parents who had once trusted Holt now shredded old photographs, unable to bear the sight of him smiling beside their families at safety fairs. Sheriff Reed, now retired but called back to assist, stood outside the command center, visibly shaken. He was with us every step of the way, he told reporters. He carried flashlights, organized volunteers, sat through every vigil. He fooled us all. Holt, meanwhile, said nothing. During booking, he remained polite, requesting a lawyer but answering standard intake questions in the same steady tone he'd used to comfort patients. Officers noted no signs of panic, only curiosity. He asked whether the excavation had reached the second site yet, a question no one outside the task force should have known to ask. His calmness unsettled even veteran detectives. Marshall later recalled sitting across from him during the first formal interview. He looked at me the way a teacher looks at a student, she said, as if he already knew how I'd react. The interview lasted nearly 4 hours. Holt denied harming anyone, but admitted being present at both houses on the nights in question. He claimed he'd been checking on a child's breathing difficulty, an emergency call never recorded in dispatch logs. When Marshall pressed for details, he smiled faintly. "I'm sure you'll find my notes. I've always been meticulous." He wasn't lying. When investigators searched his study, they found 37 notebooks spanning 3 decades. Most contained routine medical observations, heart rates, patient outcomes, training schedules, but interspersed among them were pages of coded entries that, when deciphered, matched the dates of the 2 disappearances. Each described controlled events, time of retrieval, and response intervals. Forensic linguists compared Holt's phrasing to known psychological case studies. The tone was detached, clinical, and obsessive. He wasn't writing about crimes, one analyst said. He was documenting experiments. Back in Edmonton, Dr. Elise Nakamura from the Alberta Provincial Lab led the forensic processing. She had developed the same molecular reconstruction technique that cracked the case, and now she was cataloguing every trace from Holt's property. Soil samples confirmed both graves had been undisturbed for more than 20 years, supporting the theory that Holt had built the shed specifically to conceal them. Inside the basement storage box, Technicians found 2 medical vials dated from the 1990s, containing residues of a pediatric sedative available only through emergency medical services. The lot numbers matched supplies issued to Silver Creek EMS during Holt's tenure. This was premeditated, Dr. Nakamura told Marshall during a late-night briefing. He used his position to access drugs, transport equipment, and medical knowledge. Everything was calculated. The findings left prosecutors with an overwhelming volume of evidence: DNA, chemical traces, handwritten logs, and timeline overlaps. Yet Marshall felt no satisfaction, only exhaustion. "We spent years chasing shadows," she said in her later deposition, "and all that time the answer was the man holding the flashlight beside us." When the arrest warrant was unsealed, the media exploded. Every national outlet covered the story. Editorials called it the ultimate betrayal of trust. Talk shows debated how a small town could miss the warning signs. To many Canadians, Silver Creek became synonymous with the dangers of blind faith in authority. Local residents formed a community support group for first responders traumatized by the revelation. "He taught us everything we know," said Fire Captain Laura Chen, who had worked with Holt for 15 years. "He trained us in pediatric care. He was supposed to protect the ones who couldn't protect themselves." Across the country, emergency service agencies implemented new vetting policies. Background checks were redone from scratch. Some towns suspended volunteer programs entirely until external reviews were completed. Meanwhile, Marshall and her team prepared the case for trial. Months of cross-checking, retesting, and documenting every chain of custody detail followed. The Crown Prosecutor, Victoria Mendez, described the case as forensically airtight but emotionally explosive. Every exhibit had to withstand scrutiny from a defense certain to attack decades of evidence handling. In June 2023, investigators discovered a final layer to Holt's deception. A storage unit rented under a false name contained dozens of videotapes, all blank except for date labels. Most were community event recordings, fundraisers, school CPR classes, safety workshops. Holt had filmed everyone himself. In nearly every frame, he positioned the camera toward children, often focusing on families later revealed to have received emergency calls from him. Psychologists called it a long-term pattern of rehearsal. Forensic techs found no recordings of criminal acts. Holt had either never filmed them or destroyed them, but the collection illustrated the extent of his fixation. By late summer, the case file filled 42 boxes. When Marshall closed the last one, she wrote a single note on the front: 30 years. We finally see him. The trial began on a grey September morning at the provincial court in Edmonton. Crowds filled the steps long before doors opened. Seats inside were reserved for the Morrison and Bennett families. Cameras were banned, but the sketch artists captured the same image in every drawing. Holt sitting straight-backed, expression unreadable. Crown Attorney Mendez opened with quiet precision. "This case," she told the jury, "is about trust weaponized. It is about a man who wore a uniform of service while committing acts of profound betrayal." She spent the next hour outlining the timeline, from the disappearances to the DNA match that broke the case. Her voice remained steady, clinical, never sensational. "You will see," she said, "how technology finally gave these families the truth they were denied for 3 decades. The defense, led by veteran lawyer Martin Greaves, offered a single argument: contamination. He claimed the DNA had been compromised through years of storage and that Holt was the victim of a scientific overreach. "You cannot convict a man because technology found what the human eye could not," he told the jury. But the evidence was relentless. Dr. Nakamura testified first, explaining how molecular ancestry reconstruction could recover accurate profiles from even trace materials. "The probability that this DNA belongs to anyone other than the defendant," she said, "is less than 1 in 1 trillion. Next came forensic chemists, linking the sedative vials to Holt's medical supply logs. Then analysts compared his journals to documented EMS call sheets. Dates, times, and even weather conditions matched perfectly. When photographs of the excavation site were shown, the courtroom fell silent, except for the soft hum of the projector. Judge Harmon paused the proceedings twice to allow family members to step outside. Holt himself remained composed throughout. He took notes, occasionally adjusting his glasses, whispering to his attorney. But when the prosecution displayed a volunteer search photo from 1993, Holt standing shoulder to shoulder with detectives above the very field where Grace had been buried, he looked away for the first time. Marshall, seated behind the Crown's table, later said that was the moment she knew they had him. On the 12th day, Mendez introduced Holt's notebooks into evidence. She read excerpts in a steady voice, phrases like retrieval complete, subject response minimal, containment stable. Each line mapped precisely to known case data. Greaves objected repeatedly, calling the journals fictional musings. But forensic handwriting experts confirmed they were written in Holt's hand, and soil samples embedded in the paper fibers matched the orchard where the bodies were found. When the judge overruled the objection, Mendez turned to the jury. He documented his crimes as though they were procedures. This is not fiction. This is record-keeping. After nearly 3 weeks of testimony, the prosecution rested. The defense called only 2 witnesses, a retired colleague who described Holt as methodical but kind, and a data analyst who challenged the statistical certainty of the DNA algorithm. Neither swayed the jury. On the final day, against his lawyer's advice, Holt chose to speak. He did not apologize, he did not deny. He simply said, "I wanted to understand control." His tone was academic, detached. "People call it evil, I call it observation. I needed to know how trust worked, how close you could stand before someone saw the truth." The judge ordered his microphone cut halfway through the statement. 4 hours later, the jury returned unanimous verdicts of guilty on all counts. Judge Harmon sentenced Holt to life imprisonment without parole and added a rare judicial commentary. "You took the mantle of healer and turned it into a disguise. You betrayed not only these families, but every citizen who ever opened their door to help." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes settling on the courthouse steps. The Morrisons and Bennetts stood together before the microphones, their voices quiet but steady. "We waited 30 years, David Morrison said. "Now we can stop waiting." Detective Marshall, watching from the crowd, felt no triumph, only a long, delayed stillness. "Some cases don't end with victory," she later said. "They end with truth. That has to be enough." In the months that followed, Silver Creek began to heal. A memorial garden replaced Holt's property, 2 birch trees planted side by side, a plaque reading, "They were found and they are known." Each October and May, the community gathers there for a candlelight vigil. The Alberta Bureau of Investigation adopted new guidelines inspired by the case, known nationally as the Silver Creek Protocol, requiring every cold case to be re-examined with emerging technology every 5 years. At the 2024 Law Enforcement Conference in Toronto, Marshall summarized it best. "Evidence doesn't age. Our ability to read it does. Justice isn't lost, it's waiting." A year after the verdict, the courthouse in Edmonton stood quiet again. The snow had melted from its stone steps, and spring wind carried the faint sound of church bells from across the river. Inside the provincial archives, Detective Lena Marshall signed the last evidence release form, officially closing the Silver Creek file. For 30 years, that file had lived on her desk. Now it would rest inside a climate-controlled vault, labeled and catalogued not as an open wound, but as a finished story. In Silver Creek itself, the transformation was visible. The old emergency services station where Adrien Holt had once worked was shuttered, its sign removed. A new building rose beside the highway, modern, glass-fronted, with a plaque that read, "Dedicated to the families who never stopped searching." The 2 birch trees in the memorial garden had taken root through winter. Every week, visitors left small stuffed animals, handwritten notes or tiny paper cranes beneath them. The site had become a quiet destination for travelers who followed the story from across the country. Local residents spoke about it with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "It's strange," said Mayor Rebecca Winters. "For decades we thought the story ended in the dark. Now the light feels almost too bright." Sheriff Reed, now fully retired, visited once a month. He would stand by the trees with his hat pressed to his chest and whisper, "We found them, little ones. You can rest now." Nationally, the Silver Creek case changed how Canada approached unsolved crimes. Parliament established a permanent cold case DNA initiative modeled on the forensic methods used by Dr. Elise Nakamura. Every province was directed to inventory unsolved cases with preserved biological evidence, no matter how old, and retest them under the new guidelines. Within 6 months, 4 additional cold cases were reopened, and 2 were solved using the same molecular ancestry technology that had exposed Holt. Reporters began calling it the Silver Creek effect. Dr. Nakamura became the face of the revolution in forensic science. When she addressed the International Forensic Summit that autumn, she said simply, "The smallest trace still tells the truth. We just needed better ears to hear it." Her team's presentation included anonymized slides from Silver Creek, the DNA graphs, the reconstruction algorithm, the precise probability matrices that had once been just theory. Every detective in the room understood. The future of cold case work had arrived. Detective Marshall, though praised publicly, returned to work quietly. She declined television interviews and refused to write a book. "The story isn't mine," she told a journalist. "It belongs to 2 families who kept believing when the rest of us ran out of leads." She transferred to the Provincial Training Academy, teaching new investigators how to manage long-term cases without losing objectivity. Her lectures became legend: an hour of stillness, a single projector slide, 2 small shoes side by side, and the words, "Patience is the first forensic tool." Cadets said she never raised her voice, never dramatized, but everyone left the room changed. The families of Grace Morrison and Ethan Bennett spent the next year learning how to live with closure instead of uncertainty. David Morrison reopened his repair shop in Edmonton. He kept a framed photo of Grace on the counter and donated a percentage of every invoice to the Missing Children's Network. Alyssa Bennett started volunteering with the Stella Lewis Foundation, the same group that had helped her during the search years. "People think closure means peace," she said in an interview. "It really means we finally know where to put the flowers." The 2 families became close, often appearing together at community events about child safety and forensic awareness. Each insisted the story not end in fear but in vigilance. For Silver Creek's younger generation, those who had grown up hearing fragments of the legend, the revelation reshaped their understanding of trust. High school civics classes began inviting police officers and paramedics to speak openly about transparency and background checks. The local community college introduced a course titled Ethics in Emergency Service, using transcripts from the Holt investigation as a case study. Pastor Eli Rogers summed up the town's recovery during a memorial service. "Evil didn't live here forever. It only borrowed the uniform of good, and once we recognized that, we took it back." 1 year after Holt's conviction, Detective Marshall recorded a short statement for the provincial documentary series Justice Reclaimed. Her voice was calm, deliberate, the same tone she'd used on every press line since the beginning. "People ask what it feels like to solve a 30-year mystery. The truth is, you don't solve something like this. You endure it until the facts stand up on their own. Every day you look at the same photographs, the same evidence bags, and you promise yourself you won't stop seeing them until someone else does too. Technology helped us, yes, but persistence, that's what broke the silence." The clip went viral, shared millions of times under the hashtag #DangSilverCreekTruth. In the prison north of Edmonton, Adrien Holt lived under constant observation. He spent most days in the infirmary library, reading medical journals he would never again practice from. According to officials, he rarely spoke, never wrote letters, and had no visitors. When a reporter mailed him a question, "Do you feel remorse?" the envelope came back unopened, stamped refused by addressee. It was the last anyone heard from him. By the spring of 2024, Silver Creek had rebuilt its sense of community. The annual festival that once centered on harvest season was renamed the Vigil of Light. Every booth donated part of its proceeds to provincial cold case funds. Children carried candles in glass jars instead of balloons, and the night ended with a moment of silence broken only by the sound of wind through birch leaves. Detective Marshall attended quietly at the back of the crowd. When the mayor asked her to speak, she stepped up to the microphone, the glow from hundreds of candles reflecting in her glasses. For 30 years, this town lived in the shadow of questions. Tonight, we stand in the light of answers. Grace Morrison and Ethan Bennett brought us here, not by what was taken from them, but by what they gave back. The truth. And truth, she paused, is the one thing that never really goes cold. The crowd remained silent for a heartbeat, then lifted their candles higher, 1,000 points of light against the night sky. Months later, when the first snow of winter touched the memorial garden again, 2 children, born long after the tragedy, were seen playing under the birch trees, chasing the snowflakes that drifted down. Their laughter carried across the quiet field, echoing off the frozen stream. It was a simple sound, but for Silver Creek it meant something profound. Life had returned. Because sometimes justice isn't denied, it's delayed until someone refuses to stop asking the questions. And tonight we've seen how even the smallest trace of truth can survive decades of silence. If you've stayed with us through this case, thank you. Before you go, hit that subscribe button, tap like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. It helps more people find these investigations and keeps every cold case from fading into the dark. I'm your host, and this has been Cold Case Desk. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the truth always leaves a trace.